Why was everyone laughing when she climbed into the Apache? Because they thought it was a joke. The hangar's cold metal air held the weight of condescension, that invisible heaviness that never needed words. The rotors above were still, but the tension inside spun faster than any engine. She moved with quiet precision, each motion calculated, controlled, deliberate. Every strap, every buckle, every switch. Her calm unnerved them more than any defiance ever could. Major Astrid Vanek didn't need to speak to be heard. That was what unsettled them the most. "Careful, sweetheart," Colonel Warren Blackwood called out, the mocking tone carrying easily through the echoing space. "That Apache's not a toy." Laughter followed, sharp, hollow, performative. The kind of laughter used to fill silence before it turned uncomfortable. She didn't look up, didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing it land. From the observation deck, Pentagon officials watched, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. For them, this was a formality, a field evaluation of the Apache division at Fort Riggs, one of the Army's most prestigious air bases. For Astrid, it was another test in a life that had never stopped testing her. Before dawn, she had stood alone in her quarters, staring at the photograph tucked away in a drawer, the same ritual she performed before every major flight. 3 faces smiled from the faded image, her own, and 2 men in desert fatigues. She never lingered long enough to remember the laughter that photo once carried, just enough to remind herself why she flew. Now, as the hangar lights glared above, that small, private memory was the only warmth she carried. Colonel Blackwood's voice broke through again, booming and self-satisfied. "Today," he declared to the watching officers, "our elite pilots will demonstrate the capabilities that make this division the backbone of Army aviation." He paused, letting the word elite hang in the air, a subtle reminder of who he thought did and didn't belong to that category. Astrid heard him but didn't flinch. She'd been hearing variations of that message her entire career. Captain Thaddeus Ridge approached with 2 cups of bitter, overbrewed military coffee. He handed her one, his voice pitched low. "Nervous?" She didn't look up. "Should I be?" Ridge smirked, leaning against the briefing table beside her. Blackwood's wound tight. Pentagon brass always make him twitchy. "So," she said, flipping a page of the flight plan, "a normal Tuesday." Across the hangar, a group of pilots snickered near another Apache. Every movement in their cluster was swagger, hands in pockets, polished boots, flight suits zipped halfway down to show off mission badges. She'd flown longer hours than all of them combined, but none of that mattered here. "Political appointment," one muttered. "Diversity hire," another added, grinning at his own cleverness. She didn't look their way, but Ridge caught the slight tightening of her jaw, the whitening knuckles around her coffee cup. He opened his mouth to say something, then stopped. Astrid didn't need defending. She never had. At the center of the hangar, Blackwood stood over a roster board, his posture radiating the kind of authority that came from equal parts competence and ego. A younger officer, Major Zephyr Carrington, his XO, handed him a clipboard. The colonel's frown deepened as he scanned the flight schedule. "Vanek is slated for the vertical recovery demonstration." Blackwood's tone made the question sound like an accusation. "Yes, sir," Carrington replied. "She's logged the most hours in that maneuver." "In simulation," Blackwood corrected sharply. "This is a live demonstration with Pentagon brass. We can't afford uncertainty." "With respect, sir, her simulator scores are." "Simulators don't account for pressure, Major." His voice snapped through the air. "Or real wind, or gravity, or the complexity of managing a $30 million weapon system when everything goes wrong." Carrington hesitated, lowering his voice. "There's something about her, sir. You should." Blackwood waved him off. "I've made my decision. Move her to the end of the roster. If we have time, she can fly." It wasn't the first time she'd been moved to the bottom. It wouldn't be the last. Carrington crossed the hangar, avoiding her gaze as he erased her name from mid-roster and rewrote it at the bottom. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything, but her face betrayed nothing. The morning briefing began with military precision. Officers stood in neat lines, helmets tucked under arms, attention sharp. The air buzzed with hierarchy and expectation. Today's demonstration, Blackwood began, packing before the assembled pilots, will determine not only next year's funding but the future of this entire program. We are being watched, judged, every move matters. He paused, letting his gaze sweep the room, and linger on Astrid just long enough to make the message personal. No improvisation, he continued. No heroics, by-the-book excellence only. The words might have been aimed at everyone, but the warning was clearly for her. When the briefing ended, the pilots dispersed. Astrid reviewed her updated flight folder and saw her assigned maneuvers had been reduced to basic cadet-level patterns. Safe, unimpressive, designed to be forgettable. Blackwood appeared beside her like a shadow. Problem major. No, sir. Good, he smiled thinly. Remember reliability over creativity, and try not to break anything this time. Nearby officers chuckled quietly. Astrid didn't move, didn't blink. Only when he turned away did she exhale, slow, steady, contained. In the locker room afterward, the base quieted to a hum of distant engines. Alone, she reached into her pocket and unfolded a creased newspaper clipping. Helicopter crash in Khyber Pass, one soul survives. She stared at the headline until the sound of footsteps made her fold it again. Ridge leaned against the locker frame. They're setting you up to fail. I'm aware. Then why stay? With your hours, any civilian outfit would. I have my reasons, she cut in. That's the closest thing to a personal detail you've ever given, he said, a faint grin breaking through. Don't get used to it. By the time she stepped outside, the sun had burned away the last of the morning frost. The air shimmered with the heat of running engines and diesel fumes. Pilots were already in pre-flight checks, the rhythmic clank of tools and chatter filling the runway. The first demonstration launched at precisely 1,000 hours. Each pilot performed crisp, predictable maneuvers, safe, polished, unimpressive. Pentagon officials clapped politely after every landing. Blackwood watched each flight with the air of a man waiting for validation. When the last scheduled pilot landed, he exhaled, checked his watch, and turned toward the officials. Gentlemen, if you'll follow me, he began smoothly. We've prepared a systems overview inside. One of the officials glanced at the roster. We haven't seen Major Vanek's demonstration. Blackwood's smile stiffened. Unfortunately, we've run out of. We'll wait, the official interrupted. I've heard interesting things about your female Apache pilot. The colonel froze. The other officials murmured in agreement. There would be no skipping her flight. Of course, he said finally, jaw tight. One final demonstration. Astrid was already standing by her Apache, helmet in hand. When Blackwood approached, his voice lowered to a hiss. Keep it simple. Basic maneuvers only. That's an order. Understood, sir. He stalked back to the observation platform, muttering to Carrington, this should be interesting. Let's hope maintenance checked her machine twice. Lieutenant Freya, a new pilot, overheard the remark. Her brow furrowed, but she said nothing. Astrid climbed into the cockpit. Her hands moved with the confidence of muscle memory, switches flipping, gauges flickering to life. Over the speakers, Blackwood's voice came again, amplified for all to hear. Careful, sweetheart, that Apache is not a toy. The laughter that followed was uglier this time, thinner, forced. The rotors began to spin. Slow at first, then faster, the air vibrating with the pulse of power. The chuckles died as the thunder built, until the only sound was the roar of turbine engines and the rising rhythm of possibility. The Apache lifted off, hovering just above the tarmac before ascending with mechanical grace. For several minutes, she performed exactly as ordered, simple, perfect, forgettable. Pentagon officials nodded politely again. Blackwood looked satisfied. Then, without warning, the Apache banked hard to the right. Command, requesting permission to demonstrate recovery from extreme angle of attack. Her voice crackled through the radio. Blackwood's hand shot to his transmitter. Denied. Return to approved pattern immediately. That's an order. Silence. The Apache climbed sharply, nose pointed toward the sun, straining against gravity. What the hell is she doing? Blackwood barked. Carrington, override her controls. Tower can't override in flight, sir, Carrington replied. Only emergency shutdown. And that would crash her, Blackwood snapped. On the ground, personnel had stopped what they were doing, eyes tilted skyward. Even the wind seemed to pause. Lieutenant Acaffer stood beside Ridge, tension rippling through her voice. Is she trying to kill herself? Ridge's eyes stayed on the helicopter. Just watch. At 10,000 feet, the Apache stalled, or so it seemed. Then it rolled impossibly into a perfect inverted loop. The crowd gasped. One of the officials pulled out his phone to record. Blackwood's face turned pale. The Apache continued, executing a sequence of maneuvers so fluid it looked choreographed. Rolls, dives, climbs, the machine and pilot moving as one. Not showboating, not reckless, controlled, precise. When she brought the helicopter down moments later, the silence on the tarmac was absolute. Then, slowly, applause began from the officials, hesitant at first, then swelling into astonishment. Blackwood was already marching forward, rage barely concealed. What part of basic maneuvers was unclear, Major? He barked. Astrid stood at attention, helmet tucked under her arm. I demonstrated a recovery technique, sir. You demonstrated insubordination and reckless endangerment of Army property. A Pentagon official interjected, his tone calm but cutting. Colonel, that was the most impressive Apache handling I've ever witnessed. With respect, sir, Blackwood said tightly, what you witnessed was a pilot ignoring direct orders. Actually, another official said, what we witnessed were advanced recovery techniques, ones not currently in any manual. Because they're suicidal, Blackwood muttered. Not from what I just saw. Carrington stepped forward, holding a tablet. Sir, there's something about Major Vanek you should see. Blackwood snatched the tablet, eyes scanning rapidly, then stopping. His face shifted from irritation to disbelief. This says she served 3 tours in, he broke off. Yes, sir, Carrington said quietly, and she was the test pilot for the Khyber Pass program. The words rippled through the ranks like wind through grass. The incident at Khyber Pass, Carrington continued, that was her. Blackwood looked at Astrid, truly seeing her for the first time. The anger drained from his face, replaced by unease. Why was I informed? One of the officials stepped closer. The program required unbiased evaluation. We needed to see if her methods would be accepted on merit, not on reputation. And if they were, then we'd know what kind of leadership we were dealing with. The implication landed like a quiet explosion. Around them, the same men who had laughed hours earlier stood rigid, the weight of realization heavy on their shoulders. Astrid said nothing. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply waited steady, composed, as if 10,000 feet above the noise once more. No words could have cut deeper than her silence. And in that silence, Colonel Blackwood understood something he'd never admit out loud. He hadn't been testing her. He'd been exposing himself. Why did the colonel suddenly look like a man standing at the edge of his own undoing? Because for the first time that day, the ground beneath his authority began to shift. The tarmac was silent except for the soft click of boot heels and the distant hum of the Apache's cooling rotors. Colonel Blackwood held the tablet in trembling hands, his eyes darting across the classified lines that revealed a past he was never meant to overlook. The Pentagon officials stood still, letting him read, letting him understand. 3 Tour, Classified Operations, Test Pilot, Khyber Pass Survivor. Every sentence tore away the assumptions that had built his arrogance. Finally, he looked up, his voice lower now, stripped of authority. "This can't be right." "It's all verified," Major Carrington replied, his tone quiet but firm. "She wasn't just on the Khyber mission, sir. She was the pilot, the one everyone thought didn't make it out." A murmur rippled through the gathered personnel. The legend of the ghost pilot had floated around Fort Riggs for years, whispers of an Apache that flew through impossible weather to save a stranded team, the pilot presumed dead afterward. No one had ever connected it to her. Until now. Blackwood turned toward Astrid. "Why didn't you say anything all this time?" "My orders were to integrate," she said calmly, "not to command special treatment." The simplicity of her answer hit harder than anger ever could. One of the Pentagon officials stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Colonel, today's demonstration wasn't just about flight capability. It was an evaluation of leadership, of command culture." Blackwood blinked, realizing, "You were testing me." "We were testing the environment," the official corrected. "Innovation only survives under the right command." Around them, whispers swelled. The same men who had snickered earlier now stood stiff, their silence a mix of guilt and awe. Lieutenant Ockhaffer's gaze darted between Astrid and the officials, trying to piece together the new reality forming in front of her. Blackwood swallowed hard, voice breaking through the murmurs. "You were never here for the demonstration, were you?" One of the officials gave a faint smile. "No, Colonel. We were here for the future of this program, and to see if Fort Riggs was ready to host it." He turned to Astrid. "Major Vanek, your techniques have already exceeded simulated projections. What you demonstrated today wasn't a performance," she interrupted softly. "It was muscle memory." The official nodded. "Exactly, which is why you'll be receiving new orders." Before she could respond, the shrill whine of an approaching aircraft broke through the tension. A transport helicopter touched down at the far pad, kicking up dust and scattering papers. Soldiers disembarked, uniformed, serious, moving with urgency. One among them walked with a cane. Astrid's composure cracked for the first time, barely perceptible but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. Her hand moved subconsciously toward her pocket, the one where she kept that worn photograph. "Major Vanek," her radio crackled. "Report to the briefing room immediately. Operation Thunderbird is now active." Her eyes flicked up, steady again. "Understood." As she turned away, the man with the cane looked up, and for a moment their eyes locked across the hangar. The noise around them faded. The weight of 4 lost years pressed in from all directions. "Major Evander Calloway." The one from the photo. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The acknowledgement between them was enough. The briefing room pulsed with controlled chaos. Digital maps glowed across walls, satellite imagery flickering as new data streamed in. Officers crowded around consoles while the Pentagon team took positions near the main display. Colonel Blackwood entered, every trace of arrogance stripped away. 30 minutes ago, a Special Forces team went dark near the Khyber Pass, he announced. Their last transmission indicated mechanical failure and heavy enemy presence. Conditions in the area are deteriorating fast. He gestured toward the map. Jagged mountain terrain, harsh winds, shifting storms. The kind of place where helicopters went to die. Standard extraction is impossible. The team has approximately 4 hours of oxygen remaining. A Pentagon general frowned. Operation Thunderbird wasn't scheduled to activate until next week. The systems aren't fully integrated. Blackwood's response was grave. Enemy forces don't follow schedules. The room stilled. "I need volunteers for an extreme conditions extraction," he continued. Given altitude, wind, and terrain, this qualifies as a suicide mission. Astrid stepped forward without hesitation. I'll take it. Every head turned. Captain Ridge rose beside her. I'll co-pilot. The silence that followed was total. Blackwood stared at them both, torn between protocol and the memory of her impossible flight. The terrain exceeds even your demonstrated capabilities, he warned. Wind speeds alone. That's why I'm volunteering, sir, she interrupted. Conventional methods won't work. Blackwood hesitated, then finally he nodded. Prep for immediate departure. The room erupted into motion, technicians calling out data, officers relaying coordinates, systems analysts updating satellite feeds. Amid the movement, Blackwood called out quietly, Major Vanek, a moment. When they were alone, the hardness in his voice softened. I owe you an apology, but right now I need to know, can you actually pull this off? The maneuvers I demonstrated weren't for show, Colonel, she said. They were designed for situations exactly like this. Then why stay silent all these months? With respect, sir, Astrid replied evenly, this mission is why I didn't. The program needs pilots who can follow orders and commanders who give the right ones. Testing both was necessary. Blackwood nodded slowly, the lesson landing deep. The team leader in Karakoram, do you know who it is? Her composure wavered for just an instant. Major Zeke Calloway. Your husband. She didn't confirm, didn't deny, only said, I'll bring them back. Outside, the base had transformed. Where earlier there had been laughter, now there was only urgency. Mechanics rushed to arm and refuel the Apache. Techs uploaded mission data. Radios crackled with coded chatter. And waiting at the edge of the tarmac, leaning on his cane, was Evander Calloway. Evander, Astrid said softly. You shouldn't be here, he replied, his voice low but steady. When I heard Thunderbird activated early, I knew something was wrong. He hesitated. It's Zeke out there, isn't it? She nodded once. The brass says it's impossible, he continued. They say extraction can't be done. That's why I'm going. Evander's jaw tightened. 4 years ago, you flew through hell to bring me home. It cost you everything. Not everything. They buried what you did, he said. Stripped your record, made you start over. You should be a colonel by now. The program matters more than rank, she said. And right now, so does your brother. Their eyes met, a quiet battlefield of shared history and unspoken things. Then he stepped back, offering a sharp military nod. Fly safe. The storm was already building over the mountain range by the time Astrid reached the flight line. The Apache's silhouette loomed against gray skis, blades glinting under floodlights. Technicians swarmed around it, making last-minute adjustments. Lieutenant Okafor sprinted up with a tablet. Ma'am, conditions are worsening faster than predicted. Command's considering a scrub. Not an option. Okafor hesitated. The techniques you demonstrated earlier, they were meant for this, weren't they? For when nothing else works. Astrid glanced at her. Every maneuver serves a purpose, Lieutenant. Remember that. She climbed into the cockpit, movements smooth and economical. Captain Ridge followed, sealing the hatch behind him. Blackwood and the Pentagon officials stood nearby as the engines roared to life. The air filled with the familiar thrum, low at first, then rising into a physical vibration that hummed through the chest. Before she lifted off, one of the generals stepped forward, removing the insignia from his jacket. Underneath, the stars of a general gleamed. The murmurs began instantly. Major Astrid Vanek, he said, voice amplified over the roaring wind. 4 years ago, your actions at Khyber Pass saved 12 lives. Your subsequent work in extreme recovery has redefined what we believed possible. He handed a document to Blackwood. Blackwood read aloud, his voice carrying over the noise. By order of the Joint Chiefs, Major Astrid Vanek is hereby promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, effective immediately. Furthermore, she is appointed director of the newly established Extreme Aerial Recovery Division. Gasps rippled through the personnel. Astrid remained composed, only replying, "Sir, we have a team waiting for extraction." The general nodded. "Then go bring them home." Blackwood stepped forward, voice steady now. "The Apache is yours, Colonel. Godspeed." Across the base, soldiers stood at attention. No more laughter, no more condescension, only the sound of respect. As Astrid donned her helmet, Evander watched from the shadows, pride and fear warring silently in his eyes. "They finally got it right," Ridge said quietly through the intercom. "The mission isn't over yet," Astrid replied, fingers tightening on the controls. The rotors screamed to full speed. Dust spiraled into the air. The Apache lifted off, rising into a storm that seemed to close around it like a curtain. Below, Colonel Blackwood stood unmoving, watching as the aircraft disappeared into the clouds. He didn't speak, didn't turn away, but under his breath, almost to himself, he whispered, "Now let's see what impossible looks like." In the command center, screens flickered to life, tracking data lighting up the dark room. The air was electric, tense, focused. Every officer's gaze fixed on one dot crawling across the map toward the storm. "How long until they reach the extraction point?" Blackwood asked. "At current speed, 2 hours, 40 minutes, came the reply. "But the storm front's accelerating. Severe conditions expected in 90. "Can they go around it?" "No, sir. The storm covers the entire corridor." Blackwood's jaw set. "Then they'll go through it." At the back of the room, Evander Calloway stood silently, his hand gripping his cane until his knuckles whitened. The screen reflected in his eyes that tiny, blinking dot carrying everything he'd ever owed her. He'd told her to fly safe. But Astrid Vanek never flew safe. She flew true. What does courage sound like when no one is left to hear it? For a long time, it sounded like nothing at all, only the pounding wind and the vibration of rotor blades cutting through a storm that didn't want to be crossed. The Apache knifed forward into clouds so dense they swallowed the horizon. The world outside became a smear of white and gray, flashes of static lightning illuminating the cockpit in staccato bursts. Snow slammed against the windshield like handfuls of shattered glass. Inside, the cockpit lights glowed red. Astrid Vanek's face was calm, the faint reflection of her flight display painting shifting lines across her eyes. Beside her, Captain Ridge gripped his controls, scanning readouts that danced with warnings. "Winds increasing 85 knots, Ridge called over the roar. "Temperature dropping, instruments freezing." "Switch to de-icing sequence Delta 2, Astrid replied. Her tone never changed, steady, clipped, surgical. Systems hissed and clicked as the Apache adjusted, the engine straining. The helicopter shuddered, tilting violently before she corrected with subtle precision. Ridge stole a glance at her. "We can still turn back." She didn't answer. Outside, the sky boiled, a living thing that wanted them gone. Back at Fort Riggs, the command center glowed in dim light, screens tracking the Apache's position as it approached the storm boundary. Every console hummed with data, every voice hushed to a whisper. "Telemetry stable," one operator reported. "Altitude holding at 10,000. Colonel Blackwood stood at the central display, arms folded, jaw clenched. "Maintain constant feed. I want eyes on her every second." "Yes, sir." Across the room, Evander Calloway watched in silence, the end of his cane pressed hard against the floor. The image on the screen, the single dot flickering toward the swirling mass of storm, felt too familiar. 4 years ago, another helicopter, another mission, another silence. He exhaled slowly, remembering. In the cockpit, Ridge adjusted the comm frequencies. "Command, this is Thunderbird 1, entering storm cell. Visibility near 0, requesting telemetry confirmation." Only static replied. "Command, do you read?" More static. He turned to Astrid. We've lost contact. I know. Navigation's degrading. Magnetic interference. Switch to manual flight control. Ridge hesitated. Manual in this. Do it. He obeyed. The autopilot clicked off with a mechanical sigh. Instantly the helicopter bucked, thrown by crosswinds. Astrid's hands moved fast, trim adjustments, torque balance, micro inputs so precise they looked instinctive. The Apache steadied. Ridge swallowed hard. You're flying blind. Not blind, she said softly, just not by their instruments. She reached for a hidden switch panel beneath her console, activating Thunderbird system prototype. Ridge blinked. It's not field ready. It wasn't supposed to be field tested until next week, she said. Now is next week. Lights flickered, and a new interface bloomed across the screen, a ghostly 3D topography forming from partial radar echoes and heat signatures. The image was fractured, incomplete but enough. Terrain mapping online, she said. Ridge stared half-awe half-fear. You built this. Modified it, she corrected. Lightning flashed outside. For an instant her face looked carved from steel. Back at base, chaos had crept in. The signal had vanished from every system. Sir, we've lost primary telemetry, an operator called. Switch to secondary frequencies, Blackwood ordered. Already did nothing. Evander leaned forward. She'll keep transmitting as long as she can. The storm's interfering with satellite relay. Blackwood's eyes darted to him. You sound sure. I am, Evander replied. She doesn't give up mid-flight. He didn't add the next thought aloud. She gives up on nothing except herself. Inside the storm, Astrid's world narrowed to vibrations and instinct, every sense recalibrated. The helicopter was no longer machine. It was pulse, motion, breath. Altitude 9,000, Ridge said. Ice buildup on blades 3 centimeters. Adjust pitch 2 degrees left. Maintain RPM. The Apache dropped suddenly, hit by a downward gust. Ridge's breath caught. Hold. I've got it, Astrid murmured. Her hands moved faster than the turbulence itself. The helicopter leveled again, engines howling in protest. Then an alarm. Fuel flow fluctuating, Ridge called. We're burning too hot. Astrid studied the gauge. We're ahead of schedule by 11 minutes. Reroute auxiliary tanks to forward flow. Reduce drag, maintain thrust. Copy that, Ridge said. If this works, we'll reach the extraction zone with fumes. Then let's make them count. Another burst of lightning illuminated her face. The focus, the calm, the eyes that had stared death down before and refused to blink. In the command center, time had slowed to a crawl. Operators cycled through static. The storm image on the satellite feed expanded, a swirling vortex blotting out half the screen. Any contact? Blackwood asked. Negative, sir. Last signal placed them near the mountain ridgeline. Can we track residual heat signatures? Storm interferences too high. Evander moved closer to the console, voice low. She'll be using terrain mapping by now. Blackwood turned. You mean that experimental system? It's incomplete. Evander gave a humorless smile. So is she. That's why they fit. Blackwood studied him for a beat. Tell me something, Major. What really happened at Khyber Pass? Evander's expression hardened, the memories returning like shrapnel. We were stranded in hostile territory. Command called it a loss. She didn't. She came for us alone, modified her Apache mid-flight after it was hit, landed on terrain that would have killed any of us to climb. She pulled me out under fire. And afterward, they buried it, he said. Said it was reckless, that she disobeyed orders. Easier to erase her than admit the system failed her first. Blackwood's throat tightened. He looked back at the storm image, realizing, maybe for the first time, what real leadership looked like. At 10,000 feet, Astrid and Ridge approached the extraction coordinates. The storm had thickened into a living wall. According to mapping, the team's shelter is below us, somewhere inside that crevasse, Ridge said. No visible approach, no landing zone. They're under an ice shelf, Astrid replied. Standard descent's impossible. She throttled down, eyes narrowing. So we won't descend standard. Ridge frowned. What does that mean? Something I tested once. He didn't get to ask what. The helicopter tilted hard. The horizon vanished. They were nose down, blades slicing air in controlled chaos. Astrid. Inverted descent, she said, voice calm, using rotor momentum to control drop rate. You'll tear us apart. Not if I balance the torque. The Apache spun in a maneuver that no manual had ever imagined. Gravity yanked, wind screamed, metal groaned, and yet somehow it held. Through the storm's veil, the crevasse appeared, a narrow slit in the earth, barely wide enough for the aircraft. There, Ridge shouted. I see it. She leveled the helicopter's skids just above jagged rock, her breath steady. Deploy beacon, she ordered. Ridge pressed the switch. A soft ping pulsed on the scanner. Team located, he said, but their buried snow drift collapse. Astrid's knuckles tightened on the controls. Hold altitude. What are you doing? Landing. There's no ground. There's enough. The helicopter touched down on a ledge barely wider than its frame. The skids groaned, metal flexing. Snow cascaded down the cliffside. Ridge stared through the window, disbelief in his voice. You just landed an Apache on a ledge in a blizzard. She unbuckled her harness. Keep systems hot. He blinked. Where are you going? To dig. She stepped out into the storm. Minutes blurred into hours at Fort Riggs. Every attempt to regain signal ended in static. The operators looked exhausted, their faces washed pale in the glow of failing monitors. Any sign? Blackwood asked again. Nothing. It's been 3 hours. Evander stood motionless, waiting, listening to the emptiness between radio bursts. Then suddenly, a flicker of sound. Sir, wait, getting a signal. Patch it through. Static erupted, followed by a broken transmission. Extraction complete. 6 survivors, severe conditions, returning. The room froze. Confirm source, Blackwood barked. Voice match, Colonel Vanek. Evander exhaled, emotion breaking through the mask he'd worn for years. She found them. Blackwood's eyes stayed on the screen. Now she has to get back. In the mountains, Astrid guided the wounded soldiers into makeshift harnesses rigged from stripped weapon mounts. They were shivering, half-conscious, frost biting at exposed skin. Ridge leaned out to secure them as wind threatened to rip everything loose. Mount integrity at limit, he shouted. They'll hold, she said, climbing back into her seat. You don't know that. She glanced at him. I didn't know we'd make it this far either. The engines roared. The Apache lifted, rising from the ledge in a maelstrom of snow and ice. Ridge's voice cracked through the headset. We're overweight, center of gravity's off. Then fly unbalanced, she replied. The helicopter pitched violently, nose dipping, tail swinging. But Astrid held it, every muscle wired to each motion. The machine obeyed her because she didn't ask, she commanded. Wind slammed them again, shaking the cockpit. Warning lights flared red. Stabilizers at threshold. Override them. They'll fail. Then we'll fly without them. Ridge looked at her in disbelief, then did as she said. The system screamed, but the helicopter leveled. Outside, visibility was near zero. The world had shrunk to turbulence and noise, a monochrome battlefield of air and gravity. Altitude dropping, Ridge warned, 9,858. Compensating. How? With everything we've got left. The helicopter surged upward, straining, engines shrieking like something alive. When they broke through the storm's upper layer, sunlight exploded across the cockpit. Both pilots blinked, momentarily stunned by the brightness. They were above the clouds. The storm raged below, a sea of gray fury, but up here the sky was impossibly blue. Ridge laughed breathlessly. "You're out of your mind." Astrid didn't answer. Her gaze was distant, the edges of exhaustion creeping in. He followed her line of sight to the small photograph taped beside her instrument panel. 3 faces, desert sun, youth, hope, all the things war erases. He looked back at her, voice softer now. "You flew into hell once for him, now for his brother." Her hands tightened on the controls. "That's not why." "Then why?" She hesitated. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind." The words hung between them, fragile, heavy, true. Back at Fort Riggs, dawn was breaking. The storm had reached the base, sleet hammering against glass. Operators fought to stabilize communications. Signals faint but returning. Blackwood leaned over the console. "Lock on." Through static, a voice emerged, faint, distorted but unmistakable. En route, storm crest cleared, survivors alive. Relief washed through the room. Cheers erupted, restrained but real. Evander turned away, pressing a hand to his face. For the first time since the mission began, he allowed himself to breathe. Blackwood glanced at him. "She's bringing them home." Evander nodded. "She always does." Outside, the storm continued to howl, but above it, somewhere in the blinding expanse of sky, one helicopter cut through, defying gravity, defying expectation, defying every limit ever placed on her. And in that storm between earth and sky, Colonel Astrid Vanek whispered to no one. "Not this time, no one gets left behind." The radio crackled faintly, her voice carried across miles of chaos. And Fort Riggs listened to the sound of the impossible, returning home. How do you return to a world that expected you not to come back? The sky broke open over Fort Riggs just as the first orange glow of morning touched the horizon. Rain hammered the runway, wind clawing at everything that dared to stand still. Soldiers lined the perimeter, eyes fixed on the distant sky, waiting for the impossible dot to reappear. "Radar contact," an operator shouted in the control tower. "Bearing 319, low altitude." Blackwood leaned forward. "Visual confirmation." "Negative. Storm interferences still heavy, sir." "Then keep looking." Minutes passed. The static of the radios blended with the drumming rain. Every heartbeat felt like an eternity. And then through the curtain of mist and sleet came the sound, faint at first, then unmistakable. The deep, throbbing pulse of rotors fighting their way home. Someone on the tarmac shouted, "Eyes on, I see her." The Apache emerged from the storm like a ghost resurrected. Paint scorched, tail assembly rattling, left skid bent but still flying, still defiant. The base erupted into movement. Medical teams sprinted toward the pad. Ground crews waved flares through wind and rain. Inside the cockpit, Astrid Vanek kept her eyes forward, the lines of exhaustion etched deep into her face. Her hands trembled on the controls, not from fear, but from fatigue that went bone deep. Captain Ridge sat beside her, helmet off, eyes glassy with disbelief. "I can't believe we made it," he whispered. "You can believe it," she murmured. "Just don't get used to it." The helicopter descended slowly, shaking with every foot of lost altitude. When the skids finally touched the pad, the Apache groaned like a wounded animal, rotors slicing through the rain before slowing to stillness. For a moment, no one moved. Then the side hatch opened and the storm spilled in. The rescued soldiers, 6 of them, were pulled out one by one, carried through the rain into waiting med tents. Their faces were pale, lips blue, but alive. Alive. When the last stretcher passed, Astrid unbuckled her harness. Her body protested every movement, but she forced herself to her feet. She climbed down the ladder, boots splashing into puddles, rain soaking her flight suit. Blackwood was there before she even reached the ground. He looked nothing like the man from the hangar that morning. His posture wasn't commanding now. It was human. He stepped forward, voice quiet. "You brought them home." Astrid met his gaze. "That was the mission, sir." It was supposed to be impossible. Most things worth doing are. Behind him, the Pentagon officials had gathered, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. One of them, the same general who had promoted her hours before, spoke up. "You just flew through a storm the Pentagon systems labeled unflyable. We lost your signal for over 3 hours. How did you maintain orientation?" Astrid's eyes lifted briefly toward the sky. "You don't orient in a storm," she said softly. "You endure it until the sky remembers you." No one responded. Some truths didn't need validation. Medical staff approached, offering blankets, but she waved them off. "See to the survivors first." Ridge climbed down behind her, limping slightly. "For the record," he muttered, "I'm never flying with you again." She gave a tired half-smile. "You say that every time." He laughed once, hoarse, quiet. "Yeah, I mean it less every time." Hours later, the base had calmed. The storm had passed, leaving behind the soft hiss of rain and the scent of wet earth. Inside the command center, debriefing had already begun. Astrid sat in front of a long table lined with Pentagon officers and senior staff. Her flight suit was still damp, her hair pulled back, her expression neutral. The faint hum of projectors filled the silence as drone footage replayed the last known telemetry of her mission, until the signal had vanished into the storm. General Harlan Quinn, the highest-ranking officer present, leaned forward. "Colonel Vanek, what you accomplished today goes beyond any existing standard of aerial recovery. We've reviewed your onboard recordings. Your techniques defy conventional physics." "They defy hesitation," she replied evenly. Quinn nodded slowly, studying her. "You lost communication, navigation, and power regulation. How did you maintain composure under those conditions?" "Because I've been there before," she said simply, "and I promised myself I'd never leave anyone there again." One of the civilian analysts leaned closer. "You mean Khyber Pass?" Astrid didn't look at him. "Yes. Records show you went off mission protocol, directly disobeyed orders." Her eyes met his now, calm but sharp. "Records don't show everything. Sometimes the right call isn't the one that survives paperwork." The room fell silent. After a long moment, General Quinn exhaled. "Colonel, the Department of Defense is reinstating your full service record. Effective immediately, your classified achievements under Operation Phoenix are being declassified and entered into official commendation. You'll be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross." She didn't react, didn't smile, only asked, "What about my team?" "They'll live," Quinn said, "thanks to you." Her gaze dropped to the table. "Then that's enough." The general exchanged a glance with Blackwood before continuing. "Colonel Vanek, your division, Extreme Aerial Recovery, will go active within the week. You'll be commanding it." Astrid nodded once, understood. Then she stood. "If that's all, I'd like to check on the survivors." Quinn nodded, watching her leave. When the door closed, one of the civilian observers turned to Blackwood. "You ever seen anyone like her before?" Blackwood's voice was quiet. "Not once, but I've seen plenty who thought they were her." The med bay was quieter than the storm outside. Machines beeped softly. The air smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked uniforms. Astrid walked slowly between the beds, checking faces, bandaged, pale, sleeping. Each one a reminder that risk meant something tangible. At the far end of the room, Zeke Calloway, the man she'd flown through hell to find, was awake. His skin was gray from shock, but his eyes were alert. He looked up when she approached. "I told them you come," he whispered. His voice was raw, cracked from cold and dehydration. She stopped at his bedside. "You shouldn't have been out there." "Orders," he said weakly. "Bad intel, everything went wrong." "It usually does." He gave a faint smile. "Still, you came." Astrid's voice softened. "That's what we do." Zeke's gaze drifted to her hand, still trembling from hours of flight. "You risked everything again." She looked at him, expression unreadable. "No, I risked what was left." He wanted to say more, but the exhaustion pulled him under. His breathing steadied. She stood there for a long time, watching the quiet rhythm of life returning. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the old photograph, the three faces in the desert sun. She set it gently on the small table beside his bed. "Welcome home," she whispered. Outside, rain misted softly against the floodlights. Blackwood found her standing near the edge of the runway, staring out into the fog. "You could have died out there," he said quietly. "I almost did." "And you knew that when you went." She nodded. "Of course." He shook his head slowly. "You don't even sound proud." "I'm not," she said. "Survival isn't pride, it's responsibility." He let out a long breath, following her gaze toward the distant silhouettes of grounded aircraft. "When I joined the army, I thought leadership was about control, about knowing better, speaking louder. Watching you fly today," he trailed off. "You taught me something I should have learned years ago." She glanced at him. "That leadership isn't about being followed." He nodded. "It's about being trusted." For the first time, a flicker of warmth touched her expression. "Then maybe you're ready for your next storm." Blackwood looked at her for a moment, then said, "There's talk at the Pentagon. They're calling what you did today the Vanek maneuver." She gave a faint, almost amused smile. "Names don't matter, only that it works." He studied her in the half-light. "Do you ever stop?" Her answer came after a long pause. "Only when I'm forced to." Later that night, the base was quiet again. The storm had moved east, leaving behind wet asphalt glistening under security lights. Astrid walked alone down the hangar corridor, her boots echoing softly against concrete. She paused at the open hangar where her Apache rested, scorched and battered, technicians working silently around it. She stepped closer, resting a hand on the cool metal of the fuselage. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the paint, weathered, cracked, but still there. "You're a stubborn thing," she murmured. "Guess that makes two of us." Footsteps approached. Evander Calloway stopped beside her. His cane tapped lightly against the floor. "You didn't have to bring him back yourself," he said. "Yes, I did." He studied her face. "You're different from before, quieter." "Maybe I ran out of noise." He smiled faintly. "You always did believe silence said more." They stood there for a moment, both looking at the same machine that had nearly killed them years apart. "You ever wonder," Evander said softly, "why you survived that first crash?" "Every day," she admitted, "and I stopped waiting for an answer." He nodded. Maybe today was the answer. She turned toward him then, tired but with a steadiness that felt eternal. "No, today was just another question." "About what?" She looked back at the helicopter. "About how many storms a person can fly through before one finally keeps them." Evander didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The rain started again, light, persistent, soft enough that it almost sounded like breathing. Astrid turned to leave but paused at the hangar door. "Tell Zeke I'll visit in the morning." "I will," Evander said. "He'll want to see you." She nodded once, then walked away, her figure disappearing into the mist. In the tower, Colonel Blackwood watched her from a distance. His radio crackled softly with background static, the same static that had haunted the command center hours earlier. He turned off the receiver and whispered to no one, "Sometimes the storm doesn't break you. It shows you who never was." Outside, the Apache stood in silence, broken, scarred, grounded. But its rotors, still glistening with rain, caught the dim light of dawn just enough to shimmer. And somewhere deep inside that reflection, the world remembered what it had seen that day. A pilot who flew when every rule said she couldn't. A soldier who refused to measure courage by applause. A storm that tried to bury her name and failed. What happens when the storm outside ends, but the one inside does? It had been 6 days since the rescue. 6 days since the Apache came limping home through a wall of thunder. 6 days since the world decided to turn Colonel Astrid Vanek into something she'd never asked to be. Headlines called her the Storm Whisperer, the ghost pilot, the woman who flew through death. Military networks aired grainy footage of her landing, rotors torn, smoke trailing, eyes steady. They slowed it down, zoomed in, looped it endlessly. Every broadcast felt like a story about someone else. Inside her quarters, the hum of her old ceiling fan mixed with the low drone of distant aircraft. She sat at her desk, papers scattered, commendations, transcripts, official memoranda. They all said the same thing: hero, savior, icon. She stared at the stack for a long time, before folding it neatly back into its envelope. Then she slid it into the bottom drawer, next to an old photograph and a half-empty coffee mug she never washed because the stain inside looked like the map of somewhere she still couldn't leave behind. In the corridor outside, the base buzzed with energy. Cameras, journalists, public affairs officers rehearsing sound bites. Everyone wanted a piece of the miracle. Colonel Blackwood found her near the hangar, wearing her flight jacket, eyes fixed on the sky. "They're asking for you again," he said. "Press wants a statement. Pentagon's on a live feed." Astrid didn't move. "They don't need me." "They think they do." "Then they're wrong." Blackwood sighed, tucking his hands behind his back. "You can't ignore this forever, what you did." "What I did," she interrupted quietly, "was my job." He hesitated. "They're calling you a national symbol." She finally looked at him, eyes steady. "Symbols don't bleed, Colonel, I do." He didn't argue. The truth in her tone didn't need defense. She started walking toward the tarmac, boots clicking softly on the concrete. "When they start building statues," she said over her shoulder, "it means they've already stopped listening." Later that afternoon, the Pentagon broadcasted a press conference live across military networks. The hall was lined with flags and microphones, the polished floor reflecting flashes from cameras. General Harlan Quinn took the podium first, recounting the heroic recovery mission led by Colonel Astrid Vanek, his voice thick with practiced reverence. Behind him, large screens showed her flight path, the storm, the coordinates. When they finally called her forward, the room hushed. Astrid stepped up, uniform immaculate, expression unreadable. The flashes from cameras lit her face in bursts of white. "Colonel," a reporter began immediately, "how did it feel to make the impossible flight?" Astrid paused. It didn't feel impossible, just necessary. Another voice cut in. "Do you consider yourself a hero?" She looked out over the crowd. "Heroes don't choose what they become, they just choose not to stop." "Was there ever a moment," another reporter asked, "when you thought you wouldn't survive?" Her answer came slowly. "Yes, but survival isn't the same as living through it." The reporters exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to write it down or leave it alone. Someone asked about her new command, the Extreme Aerial Recovery Division. "You'll be training others to fly as you did. How do you teach what can't be taught?" Astrid gave the faintest hint of a smile. "By reminding them they're not machines." The room went still again. Even Quinn's practiced composure faltered. When the conference ended, applause followed her as she walked off stage. It was polite, admiring, detached. None of it felt real. Outside, she removed her cap and exhaled into the cold air, the applause still echoing faintly behind her like the roar of a distant engine. That night she found herself back in the hangar. The Apache stood under floodlights, stripped for inspection, rotor blades replaced, armor panels removed. A half-dozen mechanics worked quietly around it. Evander Calloway limped in behind her, his cane tapping softly against the metal floor. "You're not sleeping again." "I sleep enough." "Not really," he said. "I asked Ridge. He said you haven't been in your quarters past 300 all week." She didn't respond. He stepped closer. "You think the mission's still happening, don't you?" Her hand rested on the cold metal of the cockpit. "Parts of it." Evander sighed. "You've got to let it go, Astrid. They're safe. You did what no one else could." "That's not true," she said. "Anyone could have if they'd cared enough to try." He frowned. "That's not fair. Neither is burying pilots for following orders that should have never been given." He hesitated, then asked, "You still think about Khyber Pass?" She didn't answer. "I do," he said quietly. "Every day, but the difference is you walked away from it. You made it mean something." Astrid's gaze stayed fixed on the Apache. "You're wrong. I flew away from it. That's not the same thing." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then tell me what this is. The silence, the distance, the way you talk like you're still up there." She looked at him now, eyes tired but sharp. "Because I am. Part of me never landed." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the soft hum of machinery filled the hangar. Finally, Evander said, "You can't carry the whole storm forever." Her reply was almost a whisper, "I already am." Days turned into weeks. The world moved on from the story as it always does. The headlines faded, the praise quieted, but inside the base something deeper was changing. The Extreme Aerial Recovery Division, her division, was forming. Pilots arrived from across the country, drawn by curiosity, reverence, or both. They came expecting a legend. Instead, they found a teacher who said little and demanded much. Astrid's training sessions began before dawn and ended after dark. There were no inspirational speeches, no theatrics, just relentless focus. She drilled them on maneuvers most had never attempted, forcing them to unlearn everything they thought they knew about control. "Flying isn't about dominance," she told them once during a rare moment of calm. "It's about negotiation. You don't fight the air, you reason with it." One of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Harris, raised his hand. "Ma'am, what if the air doesn't reason back?" She smiled faintly. "Then you listen harder." The others laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. When a maneuver went wrong, and it often did, she didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "You're chasing the wind again," or "You flew with fear, not instinct." Her feedback cut, but it never wounded. It forced them to confront what flying really was: trust. By the second week, Ridge had joined the training staff. His easy humor softened her edges, translating her quiet intensity into something her recruits could understand. "She's not trying to scare you," he told the new pilots after a brutal flight. "She's trying to make you remember that fear keeps you alive. Panic doesn't." Still, Astrid's presence carried an aura that silenced a room the second she entered. They didn't see exhaustion under her eyes, or the way she lingered alone near the hangar windows long after everyone else had gone. They didn't hear the soft echoes of thunder that still haunted her sleep. Every storm leaves ghosts, some louder than others. One evening, weeks later, Blackwood found her sitting outside the hangar, alone on the metal steps, the sunset painting streaks of gold across the tarmac. "You missed the strategy meeting," he said. "I didn't miss it," she replied. "I just didn't need to be there." He sat beside her, setting a file down between them. "The Pentagon's talking about another mission. Humanitarian this time, Arctic recovery. They want your division to lead." "Already?" "They don't waste time when someone proves the impossible." She didn't answer. He studied her profile, calm, unreadable. "You don't seem thrilled." "I'm tired, Colonel." "You can step back, you know. No one would blame you." She looked at him. "Would you?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe I used to, not anymore." They sat in silence for a while. The sound of engines in the distance carried like memory. Finally, Blackwood said, "You ever think about what all this means? Everything you've done, everything it's cost." She considered it. Meaning isn't in what we do, it's in what we refuse to stop doing. He nodded slowly as if trying to absorb it. You know, I used to think courage was noise, orders, speeches, medals. Now I think maybe it's silence, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. Astrid's lips curved slightly. Then you're learning. He stood, brushing the dust from his uniform. I'll tell command you'll consider it. I won't consider it, she said softly. I'll do it. He turned back, surprised. You just said you were tired. I am, she said, standing. But tired and finished aren't the same thing. Later that night, as the base settled into quiet, Astrid walked alone to the hangar. The lights were low. Her Apache stood repaired now, new panels gleaming where the storm had burned them. It looked untouched, but she knew better. Machines remember, just like people. She reached up, resting her palm against the hull. The metal was cool. Beneath her hand, the engine's heart slept. From outside, faint thunder echoed again, far off over the horizon. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly. For a moment, it almost sounded like applause again, or maybe just wind. Then she whispered to the silent aircraft, "You and I aren't done yet." And somewhere deep inside her, something answered, not with words but with the familiar pulse of purpose returning. Because the world didn't stop needing people who could fly through storms. And she didn't stop being one of them. Why does every new beginning feel like an echo of what came before? 3 months after the storm, Colonel Astrid Vanek stood at the edge of the Arctic runway, watching her breath coil into the cold. The world around her was white, endless and silent. Snow stretched to the horizon, broken only by the faint outlines of distant mountains and the ghostly glow of twilight sun. This wasn't war. There were no enemies here, just cold, distance, and time, the kind that could erase you without ever meaning to. Behind her, the freshly formed Extreme Aerial Recovery Division was assembling for its first operation, Operation Northlight. The mission sounded simple on paper: deliver aid and extract a stranded geological team trapped in an ice canyon 200 miles north. But nothing in the Arctic was simple. The storms here didn't roar. They whispered, patient and fatal. Her new team of pilots moved through pre-flight checks, bundled in insulated flight suits, their breath misting in the blue air. Captain Ridge, now officially her second-in-command, approached with a folder in hand. "Intel says the scientists are hunkered near the Svalbard shelf," he said, passing her the file. "Satellite feed's unstable, but we've got their last coordinates." Astrid glanced through the data, her expression unreadable. "Any updates on the incoming storm?" "Still growing," Ridge said. "Forecast models call it moderate." "Moderate here means suicide anywhere else." Ridge gave a dry chuckle. "You always did have a poetic way of saying we're screwed." Before she could reply, a transport Humvee pulled up behind them. 2 figures stepped out, a Pentagon liaison in a heavy parka, and a man in civilian gear with an ID badge that read Dr. Luca's heart. The liaison saluted. "Colonel Vanek. The department requested civilian oversight for this one. Dr. Hart's joining your crew to monitor real-time recovery data." Astrid frowned. "We're not a research vessel. This is an emergency extraction." Dr. Hart extended a gloved hand. "I'm not here to interfere, Colonel. Just observe. The department wants proof your system works in low-visibility conditions." Her gaze didn't soften. "You'll get proof when they're home." He hesitated under her stare. "Understood." Ridge smirked quietly. "He'll fit right in." By noon, the sky had turned the color of steel. The wind carried the dry bite of snow, sharp enough to sting. The fleet, 3 Apache and 1 modified transport helicopter, lined up along the runway, engines spooling up with a rising metallic growl. Inside her cockpit, Astrid settled into familiar ritual. Gloves, straps, checks, silence. Her reflection ghosted across the glass, calm, older, colder. "Thunderbird leader to tower," she said into the headset, requesting clearance for lift. "Tower copies. Good luck up there, Colonel." "Luck's unreliable," she replied. "Skill enough." She heard Ridge's laugh over the comm, still humble as ever. "Just realistic." "Copy that. See you in the clouds." The rotors thundered to life. Snow swirled into white halos around the aircraft. One by one, the helicopters lifted off, vanishing into the Arctic haze like sparks disappearing into smoke. An hour into the flight, the horizon began to blur. The wind thickened, visibility narrowing to almost nothing. The storm had arrived early. "Command, this is Vanek," she radioed. "Storm front ahead of schedule, adjusting altitude." Static crackled. "Copy, signal unstable, hold." The line died. Ridge's voice came through her side channel. "We've lost base contact." "Stay close to my signal," she said. "Formation Delta 2. Dr. Hart leaned forward from the rear seat. "Shouldn't we turn back? The storm's expanding faster than predicted." Astrid's tone didn't waver. "If we turn back now, the ground team won't survive the night." He hesitated, "But the risk." "Is mine," she cut in. "Buckle in, doctor." Outside, the sky turned from gray to pure white. Snow streaked horizontally, a blinding curtain. Instruments began to flicker. Ridge's voice returned tense. "I'm losing visual, switching to thermal mapping." Astrid flipped a sequence of switches. The Thunderbird system booted up, a faintly glowing outline of terrain emerging on her display. It was glitching, incomplete but better than blindness. "Maintain altitude 8,000, she ordered. "We'll navigate by topography." Ridge replied, "Understood. Visibility 0. Dr. Hart's knuckles whitened around his seat harness. "You can't possibly see anything." "I can see enough," she said. Through static and snow, she followed the ghostly contours of the map, ridges, cliffs, wind tunnels. Every gust felt personal, every tilt of the machine answered by reflex. "Distance to coordinates?" she asked. 17 miles, Ridge said. "Fuel reserves dropping faster than expected." "Storm drag will manage." Minutes blurred into an eternity of motion and noise. Then, suddenly, "Got a thermal spike," Ridge called. "Multiple heat signatures ahead, stationary." "Visual confirm." "Negative, but the readings match human." Astrid exhaled. "That's them." They descended through the blizzard, rotors beating the air into submission. At 300 feet, the ground appeared jagged ice, steep cliffs, and a narrow canyon below. "There's nowhere to land," Ridge said. "The crevasse is too narrow." "Then we'll make it wider." "What?" She throttled down, angling the helicopter into a hover, switching to thermal-guided descent. Dr. Hart shouted over the roar. "That's insane. You'll destabilize the entire shelf." "Only if I misjudge the wind," she said. And she didn't. The Apache dropped into the canyon, blades inches from the ice walls. The sound was deafening, a cage of storm and machine. Snow exploded around them, blinding even the instruments. "Altitude 100, Ridge shouted. "Deploy beacon." Beacon out. Static, then faint blips appeared on the scanner. 6 human signatures clustered at the bottom of the gorge. "There. I see them." The helicopter flared, hovering over a tiny patch of semi-solid ice. Ropes deployed. Ridge and 2 rescue crew rappelled down into the white. Astrid steadied the aircraft, muscles locked, eyes fixed. The wind battered the hull like fists. Minutes stretched thin, voices shouted through radio bursts. Then, "Extraction complete, we've got them." "Copy that, ascend." Ridge's voice came again. "We're overloaded, Astrid, weight distribution's bad." "Then trust the air," she said softly. The Apache lurched upward, engine screaming. Ice cracked beneath the rotors, chunks collapsing into darkness below. The entire canyon seemed to tremble. "Climb, climb," Ridge yelled. "Hold tight," she said, "almost." The helicopter burst through the storm's veil and into open sky. They were clear. Back at Fort Riggs, the control tower had been silent for hours. Technicians worked feverishly to re-establish signal. Blackwood stood behind them, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the flickering radar. "Any updates?" "Still nothing, sir. We've lost all telemetry." He didn't move, didn't speak, only watched the empty grid as if willpower could bring them home. Then at last a small dot appeared. "Signal reacquired," an operator shouted. "Single Apache returning on direct course." Blackwood's breath caught. "It's her." When the helicopters finally broke through the storm and landed on the snow-slick runway, ground crews sprinted forward. The rescued scientists were rushed toward waiting med teams, their frostbitten faces dazed and blinking against the light. Dr. Hart stumbled out next, removing his helmet. His face was pale, eyes wide. She flew through an ice canyon blind," he stammered. "I thought we were dead." Blackwood helped him steady. "You're not the first to think that around her." Astrid climbed down last, shoulders stiff, exhaustion written in every motion. The cold wind cut across her face, but she didn't flinch. "Mission success?" Blackwood asked. "All accounted for." He nodded. "Welcome home." She didn't answer, just looked back toward the white expanse they'd come from. "Home, getting harder to recognize, sir." Later that evening, the debriefing began in the base's strategy room. The air smelled faintly of fuel and snow. Dr. Hart sat across from Astrid, still visibly shaken. "You flew through an unstable ice corridor," he said. "Every reading said it was impossible." "It wasn't impossible," she replied. "Just expensive if I failed." "You risked 8 lives for 6. I'd risked 1 for 1 before." Blackwood leaned forward. "Doctor, you said you were observing the system. Did it function as intended?" Hart hesitated. "Technically, yes, but it wasn't the machine that saved us. It was her. The system glitched 3 times. She flew blind half the way." Astrid corrected softly. "Not blind, just listening differently." Hart studied her for a long time. "You realize the department will want to replicate whatever instinct you're using." "Good luck with that," Ridge muttered. Astrid stood. "If that's all, I have a report to file." Blackwood nodded, dismissing her. When she left, the room stayed silent. Finally, Hart said quietly, "She's not just flying machines. She's flying herself." Blackwood's answer was low, reverent. "And that's something you can't teach." Outside, the Arctic wind howled again. The storm was fading, but its breath lingered soft, relentless, familiar. Astrid stood at the edge of the runway, helmet under her arm. Behind her, the base lights glowed like a small constellation. Ahead of her, the horizon disappeared into white. Ridge joined her, his jacket zipped against the cold. "Another storm survived," he said. "For now." He glanced at her. "You ever wonder why it's always you? Why it's always your name they send when things fall apart?" She took a long breath. "Because some of us learn to fly through silence. Others only listen when it's too late." He nodded slowly. "You're still not used to being the one they look up to, are you?" "No," she said, "and I hope I never am." They stood together for a long while, the cold pressing in around them. Finally Ridge said, "So what now?" Astrid looked out at the endless snow, her voice quiet but sure. "We keep flying, because if we stop, the storms win." And somewhere far above them, in the night sky still bruised with the last breath of the storm, the faint sound of rotor echoes faded into the distance, steady, eternal, unbroken. What do you do when the people who praise you are the same ones who'd silence you? It had been 2 months since Operation Northlight, and Fort Riggs no longer felt like the same base. Where once the sound of engines filled the mornings, now there were meetings, observers, civilians in pressed suits pretending to understand what flight meant. The Extreme Aerial Recovery Division had become a showcase, not a sanctuary. Every day, new visitors arrived, contractors, scientists, political staffers, circling her hangars like vultures dressed as visionaries. They called it progress. Astrid called it possession. Inside the command building, the conference room smelled of coffee and polished brass. A large screen displayed flight data from her missions, colored lines, graphs, numbers that tried to explain something that could never be explained. At the head of the table sat Dr. Lucas Hart, now representing the Pentagon's Special Applications Committee. Beside him, General Harlan Quinn. And opposite them, Colonel Astrid Vanek, hands clasped, uniform crisp, expression unreadable. Hart cleared his throat. "Colonel, your Thunderbird system has proven effective beyond all projections. The department intends to integrate it into a broader automated recovery platform, with your approval, of course." "Automated," she repeated quietly. "Yes, with enhanced AI guidance. Your instinctual mapping will be replicated using pattern learning algorithms. Once complete, the system can function independently." Her voice stayed even. "You want to take human pilots out of the equation." Hart smiled thinly. "Not out, just less essential." Quinn leaned forward. "Colonel, this is a strategic decision. Your system could save thousands without putting pilots in danger." Astrid's gaze didn't move. "It's not my system anymore, is it?" Quinn hesitated. "With respect, it belongs to the Department of Defense." She nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Hart pushed the contract across the table. "You'd remain program director, of course. A legacy position. You'd oversee implementation." Her fingers rested on the folder, but she didn't open it. "And when the first drone makes a mistake, when it misreads wind or ice or fear, we'll adjust the parameters." "You can't adjust what you don't feel," she said softly. Hart's smile flickered. "Emotion clouds judgment, Colonel. Machines don't panic." "No," she said, "they also don't hope." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. After the meeting, Astrid walked alone through the corridor. The sound of her boots echoed off the sterile walls. Every step felt heavier than the last. Outside, the air smelled of rain again. Strange how storms always seemed to find her, even on calm days. Ridge caught up to her near the hangar doors. "How'd the meeting go?" "They're grounding us," she said simply. He frowned. "Grounding?" "Replacing us, turning the system into an algorithm. They want to build drones that fly like me." He stared at her. "That's ironic," she offered. "Criminal," he said. "They can't program what you do." "They can try, and when it fails, someone else will clean it up." He paced beside her, frustrated. "So what do we do? Protest? Go public?" She shook her head. "It's classified. Speaking out would end the division." "So you're just going to let them take it?" Her answer came after a long pause. "I don't know yet." That night the base felt emptier. The hangars were locked, lights dimmed, guards stationed where none had been before. She found herself walking the perimeter alone, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath her boots syncing with thoughts she couldn't silence. From the edge of the runway, she could see the silhouettes of the new drones lined up for testing, smooth, unmarked, soulless. Machines meant to replace people who still had scars. Evander Calloway appeared beside her, his cane tapping lightly on the pavement. "They told me," he said quietly, "about the drones." She didn't turn. "They'll call it evolution." He studied her profile, the faint shimmer of hangar lights reflecting off her uniform. "And what do you call it?" "Erasure." He nodded slowly. "You always knew the day would come when they wouldn't need you." "I didn't think it would come this soon," she admitted. "Or this quietly," he added. They stood there, both looking at the same machines that promised progress and carried betrayal. Evander said, "You could walk away, you've done enough, more than anyone ever will." "I don't walk away from storms," she said, "even the man-made ones." The next morning the sky was pale and brittle, the air still, too still. The drone test was scheduled for 900 hours. All personnel were ordered to remain clear of the runway. Astrid sat in her office, staring at the monitor showing a live feed from the test field. The drone, designation T-01 Vanek prototype, was sleek, its paint still fresh. It launched with mechanical precision, rising smoothly into the air. Operators inside the control booth watched the telemetry scroll by. Altitude steady, systems nominal, wind compensation engaged. General Quinn stood behind them, arms folded. "Flawless so far." Hart smiled, "Just as we predicted." Astrid said nothing. She watched the flight data with a pilot's eye, noting the subtle drift the computer didn't seem to notice. "Wind speed increasing," an operator reported. "System recalibrating," another replied. Hart looked pleased. "See, it learns." Astrid leaned closer to the screen. "It's overcorrecting." "Negative, readings are within tolerance." "Look again," she said sharply. "It's fighting crosswinds instead of adjusting to them. It's compensating against lift." Before anyone could respond, the feed stuttered. Then alarms blared. "Altitude dropping. Loss of control." The drone tilted hard, spinning, sensors flashing red. The operators scrambled. Manual override engaged, no response. It hit the ground seconds later, a burst of snow and fire. The room went silent. Hart stared at the smoking wreck on the screen. It shouldn't have failed. Astrid's voice was low but clear. It didn't fail, it just didn't feel. Quinn turned to her, face pale. "How did you know?" "Because I've been there," she said. "The data was perfect, the air was." Hart's jaw tightened. "We can fix the algorithm." Astrid stood. "You can't code empathy, Doctor. You can only erase it." Later, outside the wreckage site, the air smelled of burned metal and fuel. Soldiers moved quietly, collecting fragments. Astrid stood near the perimeter, watching the smoke curl upward, blending with the gray clouds. Ridge approached, helmet in hand. "They'll blame the weather." "They always do." "You knew this would happen." She didn't answer. He studied her. "You could have stopped it before it launched." She finally looked at him. "And they would have done it anyway. At least now they've seen what happens when you remove the pilot." Ridge nodded slowly. "You're playing a long game." "I'm surviving one." That evening, Quinn summoned her to his office. The general looked older, the weight of politics heavy in his posture. He gestured for her to sit. "Colonel, officially the test was a technical malfunction. Unofficially," he hesitated, "you were right." She said nothing. He exhaled. "Hart's pushing for a second test. I'm delaying it, but the pressure's mounting. They want results before the next budget review." "They'll keep pushing until something breaks," she said. "Or someone." He leaned forward, voice lower. "You've made powerful allies but also powerful enemies. Be careful. They can't touch your rank, but they can bury your work." Astrid met his gaze. "Then they'll have to dig deep." That night she returned to the hangar. The lights were dim, the air heavy with fuel and silence. Her Apache waited in the shadows, the only machine that still felt alive. She climbed into the cockpit, running her fingers over the switches. The seat creaked familiarly. The console lights flickered on, washing her in soft amber glow. She wasn't supposed to fly without clearance. But then, storms never asked permission either. Her radio crackled. "Colonel Vanek, this is Ridge. You're not planning what I think you are you?" "Relax," she said, smiling faintly. "Just a systems check." In the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep. He sighed. "You're going to get me court-martialed by association." Wouldn't be your first time. The engines hummed to life, a sound that felt like heartbeat and memory all at once. She didn't take off, not yet. She just let the machine breathe. Her voice softened. They'll replace us one day, Ridge, maybe soon, but not tonight. Not if you have anything to say about it, he replied. Exactly. She looked out through the windshield, the floodlights cutting through mist. For a second she could almost see herself years ago, younger, reckless, unbroken. You know what they'll never program, she said quietly. What's that? The moment before you fly, when everything's silent, and you choose to go anyway. By morning, rumors spread across the base. Someone had powered up the Apache overnight. No flight recorded, no proof, just whispers. The next day, a memo arrived from the Pentagon suspending further drone tests, pending review. Blackwood read it twice before grinning. Looks like someone up there decided to listen. Astrid said nothing, just looked out the window toward the hangar where her Apache stood gleaming in the dawn light. Ridge raised an eyebrow. You had something to do with this, didn't you? She smiled slightly. Maybe the storm finally spoke for itself. That evening she walked the runway alone. The sunset painted the snow in muted gold. Her shadow stretched long across the tarmac, the air quiet except for the faint hum of distant engines. Evander's voice echoed in her memory. You can't carry the storm forever. Maybe not, but she could teach it how to fly. And as the first stars appeared above the horizon, Astrid whispered to the cold air. They can automate the skis all they want, but they'll never automate courage. The wind stirred softly in answer. Somewhere, the world still needed her kind of silence. The kind that leads, that defies, that acts. What happens after the storm ends? No one ever teaches you that part. Weeks had passed since the Pentagon's silence, since the drone program quietly dissolved into files marked under review. No statement, no apology. Just absence. For most people at Fort Riggs, it felt like a win. For Colonel Astrid Vanek, it felt like weather finally breaking after too many months of rain. But clear skis, she'd learned, carried their own kind of weight. The mornings came earlier now. She still woke before dawn, still found herself standing in the hangar long before the rest of the base stirred. The Apache gleamed under low light, newly serviced, ready, patient. It had become a mirror more than a machine. She placed a hand against its hull, as she always did, her breath clouding in the cold air. You and I have seen enough storms, she whispered. Maybe it's time to teach someone else how to fly through them. That someone arrived 2 weeks later. Lieutenant Freya, 27, bright-eyed and cautious, stepped into the hangar with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She'd been hand-selected by command and personally approved by Vanek herself. Freya stood at attention, nervous but steady. Ma'am, it's an honor. Astrid studied her for a long moment. Do you know what we do here, Lieutenant? Yes, ma'am, recovery, unconventional extraction, crisis flight. Astrid's tone stayed calm. That's the report definition. I'm asking if you understand it. Freya hesitated. We fly where others can't. Astrid nodded slowly, close enough. Then she turned to the Apache. You'll learn systems, physics, wind, but those are the easy parts, the rest can't be taught. Freya frowned slightly. Then how do I learn it? Astrid met her gaze. By failing where it hurts and flying anyway. Over the next months, Fort Riggs transformed again. Where once journalists and brass had filled its hangars, now there were only pilots, focused, quiet, learning the impossible from someone who no longer needed recognition to lead. Astrid trained them the same way she taught herself, with silence, precision, and empathy that cut deeper than discipline. Courage, she told them one morning, packing in front of the simulator bay, isn't loud. It doesn't roar or announce itself. It just keeps going after the noise ends. Ridge, who had officially transitioned to training command, watched her with quiet pride. You sound like a teacher now, he said after class. She smirked. Terrifying, isn't it? Mostly for them. But Freya didn't seem terrified. She absorbed everything, every correction, every long silence that meant look closer. By the third month, Astrid let her take the controls of the Apache under supervision. The young pilot's hands trembled at first, but her instincts were sound. Don't fight the air, Astrid said through the headset. It's not your enemy, it's indifferent. Freya steadied the helicopter, breathing through the turbulence. How do you make it listen? Astrid smiled faintly. You don't, you earn its respect. When they landed, Freya exhaled a laugh that sounded half relief, half disbelief. I didn't crash. Astrid stepped out of the cockpit. That's a good start. One evening, weeks later, Astrid sat alone in her office. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, turning the base gold and red. She was reading a letter, handwritten, folded neatly. Colonel Vanek. The committee has closed the Thunderbird drone program permanently. Officially, they cited operational cost. Unofficially, they cited instinct. You were right, Quinn. She folded it back carefully. Victory wasn't what it used to feel like. A knock on the door pulled her from thought. Freya stood there hesitant. Ma'am, the weather system's flaring over the eastern ridge. Command grounded flights, but Ridge said you used to fly in that. Astrid looked up. Used to. Freya blinked. Well, I mean. Astrid chuckled softly. Relax, Lieutenant. Tell Ridge I'll handle it. She stood stretching slightly. You're coming too. Freya's eyes widened. Ma'am. Consider it lesson 7. The sky doesn't wait for permission. The storm rolled in fast, cold and sharp, the kind that spoke in whispers before it screamed. By the time they reached the runway, visibility had already dropped. Technicians shouted over the wind, warning against takeoff. Astrid just nodded once and climbed into the cockpit. Freya followed, heart hammering. Are we really doing this? The younger pilot asked. Astrid strapped in. There's no better teacher than chaos. The rotors began to turn. Wind kicked snow into white sheets. The Apache lifted, straining against invisible walls. Freya gripped the controls. Feels wrong. Because you're forcing it, Astrid said calmly. Let go a little. I'll lose balance. Then you'll find rhythm. Freya hesitated, then eased her grip. The helicopter steadied almost imperceptibly. See, Astrid said softly. The air wants to be understood, not conquered. Outside, lightning flashed across the clouds, soft blue and silver. The storm wasn't their enemy tonight. It was their classroom. They flew low across the ridge, snow curling off the rotors, the sky humming around them. Freya's voice came through the headset, shaky but certain. How do you know when it's too much? You don't, Astrid replied. You just decide when it's worth it. She guided the helicopter through an upward current, the motion smooth, graceful. Freya mirrored her movements, finding a balance between fear and flow. When they returned to base an hour later, the storm still raged, but Freya's landing was perfect. Astrid climbed down first, looking up at the young pilot. You didn't flinch. Freya grinned, adrenaline still high. I almost did. Almost doesn't count in the air, Astrid said. Only choices do. Later that night, as the storm settled into gentle rain, Astrid found herself walking alone through the quiet hangar. Her steps echoed softly. The Apache stood motionless, drops of water beating across its frame like stars on metal. Ridge joined her a few minutes later, coffee in hand. You did it again, he said. What? Found another one who can hear the sky. Astrid smiled faintly. She'll surpass me. Ridge tilted his head. You sure about that? I hope so, she said. They stood together, the silence between them full of unspoken gratitude. After a while, Ridge asked, You ever think about leaving? Every day, she said. and every day I don't. Why? She looked out toward the rain-soaked runway. Because storms don't stop coming. Someone has to be here when they do. Weeks passed quietly. The new pilots learned. The base breathed again. Then one morning, Astrid received transfer papers, promotion to Brigadier General, reassignment to Strategic Command in D.C. She stared at the document for a long time. Every word felt heavier than its ink. Ridge found her later that day. "You're really going." "I'm being reassigned," she said. "I didn't say I was going." He smiled. "Command won't like that." "They rarely do." She handed him the papers. "If they push it, you'll take over the division. You're ready." He frowned. "You mean we're ready?" She shook her head. "I've been ready too long. It's time someone else flies through the next storm." Her departure wasn't announced. There were no speeches, no cameras, no ceremony. Just one woman walking the runway at dawn, duffel in hand, coat collar turned up against the cold. Freya stood waiting by the hangar, trying to hide her emotion. "Ma'am." Astrid stopped beside her. "Keep flying, don't chase approval. It won't catch you anyway." Freya nodded, eyes shining. "I'll try." "Don't," Astrid said softly. "Do." They exchanged salutes, one formal, one full of everything they couldn't say. Then Astrid turned toward the transport waiting at the far end of the runway. Ridge called after her, "You'll come back, right?" She smiled over her shoulder. "The sky's not going anywhere, neither am I." From the window of the transport plane, as it lifted off, she watched Fort Riggs shrink into distance. The hangars, the runway, the silver glint of her Apache catching sunrise. She thought about Khyber Pass, about the laughter in the hangar that day, about the colonel who tried to humiliate her, about every silence that had once felt like isolation and now felt like peace. Maybe the storms had never been enemies. Maybe they'd just been mirrors, showing her what couldn't be broken. Outside, the clouds parted. The horizon stretched wide, endless. She closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines blend with memory, breath, and time. And in the voiceover of her mind, soft, cinematic, resolute, came the truth she'd carried through every storm. Leadership isn't noise. It's silence that others can trust. Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's walking straight through it. And dignity doesn't argue or demand to be seen. It simply acts. Down below, on the tarmac of Fort Riggs, Freya Apache stood watching the sky, eyes following the shrinking dot of the departing plane. The storm clouds above were breaking apart, revealing pale sunlight. Ridge stepped beside her. "You think she's done flying?" Freya smiled faintly. "No, I think she just found a higher altitude." They stood there as the wind shifted, soft, calm, full of promise. And far above the clouds, unseen but certain, Colonel Astrid Vanek soared, not in body, but in legacy. A pilot who taught the world that storms don't end you. They define you.